How's the sound? Is it okay? It's a lot of echo up here. If you could turn the volume down just a little, I'll speak a little more loudly. If at any time you have difficulty hearing, just wave. Okay? I'm always mindful when we get these echoes. It's a little distracting. Pardon? Well, that's okay. I can step back here. That's all right. It's actually interesting for me to see you. So for you to see me and me to not see you works kind of counterproductively. Because then I end up speaking to my head rather than speaking to you. So I will try to find a happy medium. How's this here? Better? Okay. So this is like impossible. Right? It's probably the most obvious thing to say up front. First off, following Jürgen is impossible. And what Jürgen's kind of core message here is, it's impossible. We're not going to save the world. So I guess that's the most obvious thing to start off with. Well, it's impossible. Let me just say a couple of things that made me enthused about coming here. First off, Jürgen and I kind of arrived at MIT. I haven't had a chance to check, but it must be within 6 months of each other. So our journeys have been, I came in 1970. 72. May of 1970. And I came in August, so I was guessing pretty close. And of course, he was there before me, which is perfectly logical also, right? Sort of, somehow, I'm not sure. In any event, so we kind of started the journey together. I came to MIT with very similar motivations. I had been an undergraduate at Stanford, engineering student studying systems. One of my best friends and roommate for a couple of years worked in Paul Ehrlich's population biology laboratory. So you may not remember, but there were 3 big global bestsellers that kicked off the environmental movement. Of course, it all started with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which kind of alerted the public, particularly in the US, to the consequences of pollution, DDT in particular. Then there was a book called The Population Bomb. The third was The Limits to Growth. Those were the kind of big 3 books that in many ways created the global environmental movement. So I had been involved indirectly in that second one, because I was at Stanford when Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb. My good friend worked in his population biology laboratory. I remember the summer before I came to MIT, I worked in Germany for the summer. I found an article by Ehrlich, which I translated for all the engineers I worked with into German, so they could read about his writings, which at that time still weren't widely known in Germany. So when I came to MIT, it was kind of very similar in terms of motivation. It was very clear that there were these really big issues in the world. I, of course, didn't know anything about the limits to growth. I actually came with the idea of studying with this guy named Forrester, who I'd heard about from some other students at MIT. I'd been an engineering systems guy, and I'd kind of done all the engineering stuff. So I was really like, well, what's next? And I did this Cook's tour for about a year or 2 around Cambridge, took everybody's systems course, applied the social issues, and decided, and this probably is a biased comment, but with a group of people who share the same bias, it's easy to make these comments. System dynamics was a lot better than any others I saw. It was just so much more intuitive. It had a combination, which I loved, of a rigor and an intuitive capacity. People could actually understand, which is not the case in a lot of systems analysis. They're never going to be understood by more than a handful. So while Jürgen may be absolutely right, when you really strive to reach huge cross-sections of the population, you bump up against, this is not easy for people to understand. On the other hand, I always thought the potential, from the systemics perspective, was so much stronger because Jay had gotten to this kind of real simple core. You know, bathtubs, feedback loops, delays. And we all know those things. We don't know them because of system dynamics. We know them because we're alive. Everybody knows how bathtubs work. And we all know feedback, although it's always not as evident, but you know, obviously we have a very good recognition immediately of the reinforcing or positive feedbacks, because we can feel these things that build snowball effects, whether they're positive or negative. And with a little bit of reflection, doesn't take much, we can start to appreciate that balancing defines all living systems. We're continually in some states of out of balance, imbalance. There's no such thing as balance, right? Even you find those soldiers who've trained themselves to stand perfectly erect are not perfectly erect. It's just the micro movements to continually keep readjusting. So we all know these things. And what really struck me about what Jay had done, which I have to say still today is as stunning to me as it was in 1970, is these things, which of course I had understood as an engineer, but kind of in an engineering context, and with the methodological kind of trappings of engineers, ways of analyzing things, and all the math and so on, and the transformation functions, etc. All of a sudden I went, wow, this is it. People can get this. And I have to say that's still kind of my guiding idea. Doesn't mean they will. It doesn't mean it's easy. And we'll all spend our lifetimes working at it. That's kind of obvious. But there's something there that really could be a basis for connecting us all in understanding truly complex situations intuitively, naturally. So we got started pretty much the same time with very similar impulses or very similar kind of deep drives. You know, why were we there? It was really quite similar. I didn't actually know Jürgen at the time. I kind of knew about him, and then gradually as that Limits to Growth team formed up around Dennis and Dana, I got to know the different individuals. But I guess the obvious starting point for me here today is that kind of we started at the same time, we started the same impulse. What have we learned that's different? Jürgen's did a wonderful job of kind of summarizing his lessons from one episode after another, and obviously we all are kind of naturally awed by the opportunities. You said the good fortune. Because when all is said and done, that's about all you can ever say. The good fortune to have this opportunity, and this opportunity, and this opportunity. So I haven't organized my kind of biography or autobiography quite as coherently as Jürgen, but I just thought I'd touch on a few basic things. And semi-chronologically, not as carefully laid out as Jürgen. Bob was very kind in getting ready for this. I said, well, I'd rather not prepare anything too much in advance. I'm kind of lazy, or I don't know. I've learned over the years it's often not the best way. I'd rather kind of be at the conference, listen to what's kind of moving and things that are happening here, because this is always a great way to get in touch with the current state of the field of system dynamics, but then also listen to Jürgen and see what I might try to do to complement, to add some additional perspectives. So first off, the first thing I thought of as I was listening this morning is one of the cornerstones of our work, and I'll do a real quick summary of the journey I've been on, because I realize not everybody would have an understanding of. So pretty quickly, I stayed on at MIT. Jürgen actually and the Limits to Growth team started to split up and go in different directions. Although they stayed in close touch and formed a network that really kept them in close touch, the Resource Policy Network around the Balaton meetings. I stayed at MIT. I stayed and worked with Jay for about a decade. But then I got kind of dissatisfied with one particular thing, and you know how these things are. Something starts to kind of gnaw inside you, and you know, well, it's not because you don't like something, but there's something else that you're really called to do. And I realized what I was most interested in was this gap between the intellectual appeal of system dynamics and the practical application. So one of the things that was kind of really fun about being around Jay, he always had a remarkable group of corporate sponsors. I wouldn't say sponsors, but they were both sponsors and thinking partners. So I just met some remarkable people, all of whom were in the business world. Now, that was a little bit surprising to me, being of the age and generation that I was. We were kind of pretty anti-business. I mean, I think that way before it became a kind of almost defining feature of the environmental NGOs that business is destroying the world, that idea was very much present in the 60s and 70s. So it was quite surprising to me, and I think very illuminating, to meet these individuals who so contradicted my mental models of business people who were only interested in profit, right? That was the kind of shared mental model. The purpose of business was profit. The business of business was business. You've heard all these refrains. And yet I would meet these individuals who were quite remarkable in their depth, their breadth of interest, their personal depth, their reflectiveness. And so anyhow, one thing led to another, and we started a center at MIT in the mid-80s around systems thinking, and we call it the new management style. That evolved into a whole variety of projects throughout the 80s, which eventually got wrapped up into a book that was published in 1990 called The Fifth Discipline, which was really a reflection on what we'd learned from trying to bring this systems perspective in a very practical way into organizations. And from that point on, I kind of continued to work a bit in business and increasingly in the last decade or so in the world of education. I'll say a word or two more about that later. So that's the simple arc of the journey, but always kind of guided by this one core issue. How do people internalize this? But I would phrase it just a little bit differently than Jürgen did, because it's not different in a way, but of course maybe just the idiosyncrasies of us as individuals. One of the things that became a cornerstone of our work was the distinction between problem solving and creating. Now, it may sound just like semantics, but it's actually not. And one of the reasons it's sometimes a little not so visible to us, and I'll say us now in a particular way, most of us in this room share a kind of technical, scientific, mathematical, I'll call it rationalistic education. There aren't too many of us in this room who primarily make our money in the creative arts. We don't make music as our primary profession. We don't dance. We don't create movies. We're not in the creative arts. So that this may just sound like semantics to us, but it's really not. In the problem-solving orientation, it's easy for me to speak about this being trained as an engineer, right? In the problem-solving orientation, you start everything with a set of conditions which you don't want. Call them the problem. And then your work is to get rid of them, ameliorate them, or have something come along that will then displace them, right? That's called solving the problem. Every manager knows that. Doesn't matter what kind of organization, for-profit, non-profit. You spend most of your life solving problems. Most parents have the exact same orientation most of the time. The life of being a parent, and those of you who are young, I just want to warn you, this never ends. Doesn't matter how old they are. It can be one problem, after another problem, after another problem, after another problem. React to this crisis, react to this crisis. And I'm using that to illustrate, but sometimes it's a little easier to illustrate this point by taking a domain like parenting, which is not the professional world. It's our private, personal world. It's actually not why we're parents. It's actually not what we care about most. We care a lot about it in the moment. There's nothing more important than solving this crisis, right? You with me? But if you ask people around the world in all kinds of cultures, what are the parts of their life that are the most important, most meaningful? What do you think is one that will come up everywhere in all cultures? Kids, parenting, my family. So I'm trying to illustrate something using this context. I said it in simple words before. A cornerstone of our work has always been the distinction between problem solving and creating. And I want to say this as carefully as I can. It's not an either or. Everybody who creates anything knows they spend actually most of their time solving problems. But there's a different context. And that shift in context is the whole deal. In creating, your fundamental orientation, what you care most about, what really defines the undertaking, is what you are trying to bring into reality. By the way, that's all the word creating means. It's the verb. First definition in anybody's dictionary of to create, to bring into reality. So I use parenting as an example. At some level, beyond our ideas and even beyond culture, because it's really quite biological. There's something that matters deeply to us, to participate in the creation of another human life. Obviously, the biological part of parenting is necessary but hardly sufficient. It hardly defines it. That's the distinction between problem solving and creating. It's about context. What's primary, what's secondary. In the creating orientation, what's primary is what you bring into reality. What's secondary is the journey along the way and all the problems you need to solve. You with me? This is not a complex, logical puzzle, but it's a very subtle shift in orientation. It's a challenging one for most of us. I was referring to us as, I'll say us, overeducated in the sense of the mainstream education folks who spent much of our lives becoming more and more adept in more and more complex, sophisticated ways of solving problems. But in that process, often paying the price of forgetting or maybe getting disconnected a bit from what is it that really matters to us. What do we really want to create? So my first kind of reflection on Jürgen's journey, which he, of course, presents beautifully and in his own inimitable style, you can't not be impressed and you can't not be touched by his humility as a learner. But it's the journey of all of us, in a way, so it's a wonderful kind of starting point. Is that the question that's always been sitting in the center of this is not just Jürgen's question, it's not just the question of his little life story, it's all of our question. What are we trying to create here? What really matters to us? The problems of sustainability are not problems to be solved. I want to just say this as precisely as I can, because it's a simple point, but it's a subtle point. They're not problems to be solved. They're alerting us to a different future that we really are wanting to create. That's why Jürgen's story, of course, is so archetypal in many ways. Eventually he ends up, well, hell with you guys, I'm just going to write you a book and tell you what it's going to look like in 30 years. And then finding out, well, that doesn't seem to change anything either. In the creative orientation, fear clearly reveals its own limitations. Fear is a very powerful motivator. I would say the fundamental strategic flaw of the whole environmental movement, not just the whole environment. And by the way, I would say the same thing about the social justice movement. The fundamental strategic flaw is over-reliance on fear as a motivator. Fear is a powerful motivator. We all know that. You step out in front of a bus and you don't do a lot of thinking about what you need to do. Your whole system comes into a response mode. The only problem is fear is great for short-term motivation. But the mismatch between using the emotion of fear as a primary motivation and the character of the problems you're trying to motivate people to deal with is what is the strategic flaw I'm referring to. Problems that are long-term, deeply embedded in how we live. They're not just technical problems. If you're familiar with the terminology, it's a useful one. Ron Heifetz, for years, one of the guys writing about leadership at Harvard, has talked about the difference between technical problems and adaptive problems. Technical problems are problems that have solutions. And ultimately they get solved by applying good technical knowledge. Most technological progress occurs this way. But adaptive problems are problems about us. And they cannot be solved or resolved, or significant progress cannot be made without us changing. We need to adapt. So in many ways, Jürgen kind of bumping his head up against the wall, this wall, this wall, this wall, this wall. And again, it's kind of a journey we can all identify with. We had a chance to kind of look over his shoulder in a journey we've all been on and are likely to be on. Is continually bumping up against the wall of trying to solve adaptive problems through technical means. And what I mean by technical, I don't mean technological. Rational argument, the logic, or to be more precise, the illogic. Why would people spend their time and energy and resources going in a direction they don't really want to go, unless they didn't understand that? That's the technical reasoning. We'll help them understand it, therefore they won't do it. That was the first thing I learned in the first 4 or 5 years of trying to study application system dynamics, which, by the way, I came to the exact same conclusion. In that much more limited domain, most of the applications were tremendously unproductive because they all had the same characteristic. Models were used to convince people that if they kept doing what they were doing, they would get someplace they really wouldn't want to go. And even within the much more limited sphere of a corporate setting, which is where all these studies are done, 90% of the time, it actually led to no real change. Or the only change it would lead to was something that was very small and incremental and actually didn't have a very big cost. But again and again, you watch companies going off the cliff. These are the limits of trying to solve adaptive problems by technical means. It's not an easy pill to swallow because almost all of us are culturally immersed in a technical worldview. Again, that means technological, but a technical one. You could call it a rationalistic worldview. Jürgen used that same term at the end. And yesterday I heard one of the speakers say, well, you know, these are humans after all. They're not that rational. As if that was a flaw. See, that's the technical worldview. The flaw is we're not that rational. Bach did not create through solving that flaw. Nor did Mozart, nor did Beethoven, nor did Picasso, nor did anything that we would hold up as real kind of good examples, moving, touching examples of the creative process at work. It's not achieved by overcoming technical rationality. It's achieved by allowing that to work in service to something else. That's the shift in context I'm referring to. What's primary, what's secondary? There is a big primary question staring all of us in the face. But because we're so unskilled, not just us, this isn't the us I'm referring to now, is the big us, the us that Jürgen was referring to. There's a big question staring all of us in the face. And all the technical analysis and all the rationality will not get us off the hook of this question. And the question is really, really, really simple. It's not easy, it's just really simple. How do we want to live? What matters to us? We're just not used to that question. And all of our fascination with technical rationality, and of course now that's been augmented by technological fixes, which are an expression and outgrowth of that technical rationality in many ways, have actually undermined the core capacity which we most need to tap into to deal with these problems that Jürgen is illustrating. See, there's several little bits, and I'm going to just pick on these because to me they illustrate and try to kind of make sure I'm being clear about this main point. There's several little bits that Jürgen touched on. That to me, I would say, wait a second. I accept the data of your experience, but I do not accept the conclusion, nor do I think you do in some ways. But there's huge, you might say, anomalies here. On the one hand, the people in Norway are not willing to spend 1% extra in their tax to assure a better world for their kids. I'm paraphrasing now, but that was kind of one of those later examples. What do you think about that? Really? Personally, if someone asked you that you could spend 1% additional in your tax every year to assure a better life of your children, or even your children's children, what would you do? I would call that, in good scientific tradition, an anomaly. A data point which actually at some level makes no sense. So somehow, the way we're approaching these things is not evoking what we need to evoke in order to approach them successfully. Because I actually don't believe there are many human beings who would say no to that proposition. But we might be very skeptical about the proposition because we have no confidence it would actually happen, because obviously it's doing something now for a uncertain benefit in the future. We may have zero confidence it'll actually happen. The politicians will squander the money or whatever. Or at some other level, there's a certain fear evoked. Do I want to be a sucker here? You know, do something that's really stupid. Or there's a political, cultural perspective evoked, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm trying to illustrate that in terms of something else. Look, at this reason why I think that's a genuine anomaly, that kind of little fact that you're going to present, is that it contradicts our biology. I'm not being philosophical here. I'm trying to be reflective. It's a little different. We are biologically predisposed to care deeply about the life of children, not just our children, by the way. So somehow we're not having that biological predisposition. I've had a good benefit, like Jürgen, it's very natural to say like this, to reflect on all your good fortune. To have had some extraordinary mentors. Now, obviously, Jay was the first for that decade of mostly the 1970s into the early 80s. And then more recently, another remarkable scientist, a man named Humberto Monterana. Humberto is Chilean, quite famous in biology for something called the Santiago theory of cognition, which is arguably the first biologically grounded theory of awareness. Humberto was an experimental biologist by training. He was actually part of a team that did postdoc work at MIT, a group that eventually got a Nobel Prize for their research, although Humberto had returned to Chile before that work was really completed. But he's quite famous in the world of biology, quite famous in Chile because he's written a lot of beautiful books interpreting his scientific understanding for the lay public. I often think about Humberto as kind of an Einstein-like figure. He has that remarkable capacity as a real pioneering thinker in his field of science, who also could reflect on what the hell does all this mean for us as human beings. I was thinking about this yesterday, one of the beautiful sessions. I really enjoyed a lot of the sessions the last couple of days. Actually, this was Monday afternoon. Was one on radical listening. Now, I'll be honest with you, and I'm kind of getting to my last point here in this comment. It really warms my heart to come to a systematics conference and hear somebody talk about radical listening. And also it's in a context of doing very practical work. We're a group that really cares, a society that really cares a lot about practical application. This was Cyrus Chung, who's worked for many years with Peter Hauptmann, and the St. Louis group, Washington University and St. Louis group on collaborative modeling or collective modeling, and working in a lot of really interesting settings. Anyhow, and radical listening is listening. You with me? The only reason she's used the word radical is it's so not present most of the time. Listening is really hard. I mean, it's really hard. It's one of the hardest things in the world. Because whenever we try to listen, if we pay attention, we become aware how quickly we're projecting. We're not really listening at all. Hear one or two words, you have one or two kind of emotions triggered inside you, and then you're off to the races with your own kind of internal listening. So actually hearing what someone says is not easy. But actually a machine does it quite well. Right? A recording device listens technically. So there's clearly something a little more than just that she was trying to point to. We are not machines. None of us passively take in what arises in our sensorium, like our listening, and passively records it in the back of our head like a reverse image of a camera. Right? It's not the way we work. We are biological entities who interact with our reality, and in the process of that interacting, we create something we call awareness. That's the Santiago theory of cognition 101. And if you want a kind of simple operational test, if you don't necessarily buy what I just said, because I said it in a fairly kind of forceful way, I'd just like you to write down verbatim what I said in the last 5 minutes. Verbatim. Anybody think they could do it? Of course not. because we are not recording machines. But if I ask you to write down what you've been thinking or feeling in the last 5 minutes, it's no problem. So radical listening is a huge challenge. One of paying attention externally, but internally. This is a huge challenge for us from a scientific perspective, too. Because I would say the great lie, strong word, but it's an accurate one in my perspective. The strong lie of Western science is it actually tells us about the truth. It tells us how things really are. No, it tells us a story we think is a better story. All of us who know anything, and a lot of us in this room know a lot about philosophy of science. Science is just a different story. It's a different qualitative process to try to produce a consensus that actually is more and more consistent with what we can observe. But it's not the truth, of course. As Umberto says, all things said are said by somebody, including scientists. And all good scientists know that. And all things heard are heard by somebody. Radical listening is about not only hearing technically as best we can, which is never perfect, but hearing the person who's speaking. Not just what the person says, but the person. That kind of stepping into their shoes to the best we can. That connecting with another's life journey as best we can. That empathetic as well as technical listening. Now, because the time is short, I'm going to wrap up. I just want to use that to make kind of a final point. I do think in order to make any real headway, this is my view obviously now, any real headway on the kind of problems Jürgen talks about, we must embrace the basic question. How do we want to live? We can't get there by just fixing the problems. We have to create a different reality. Now that's big language, but here's the part that makes it a little more embraceable. Not on a big scale. Right here, right now. That's why I was so taken by the comment of radical listening, because when we listen deeply, not only to what's said, but who's saying it, to the best of our ability, never perfect, a different relational space starts to come into existence. And it's that relational space which gives us some guidance or clue as to what the reality we want to live in is. I personally tend to think it's useful to look at all these problems in a simple historical lens. Human beings were not always as confused as we are today. Now you might say we're always confused at some level, but I would say we're at a very heightened level of confusion right now, which is what makes it so, again, strange, some of the experiences Jürgen has. I mean, if you really step back and look at it, how could people actually react that way? Well, it's because we're not working at our best. We've drifted a long way from what we know is possible. I have one last thought that illustrates more than I was going to share a couple of tools and all, but I think we should end here. I've also spent a little bit of time in China over the last 20 years. Slightly different path than Jürgen's, about 1 month a year for the last 20 years. Partly it's because of a lifelong interest in Eastern Asian philosophy. But gradually, as I come to understand it, recognizing also that obviously the 21st century will be shaped by China and India. That's not a radical statement. Just as the 19th century and 20th century particularly was shaped by the West, the world we live in today will be shaped by the East. So I too have watched very carefully and been a little bit involved, a little bit like Jürgen, a little bit in different ways with these shifts. You know, it was in 2010. Almost no attention paid to it in the West. In 2010, the Central Committee at its big gathering every fall adopted a decarbonization strategy. The initial goal in 2010 was a 40 to 45% reduction in carbon intensity of the Chinese economy by 2020. It was almost completely ignored in the West, which is another story. Given how important China is, we all know that the fact that that was completely ignored. Everybody in China knew. Very few people outside. I talk to groups all the time. How many people know about China's decarbonization strategy going back to 2010? Very well-informed groups. Rarely do I get more than 5% of the hands go up. And they're now continuing. And they are on a radical path to decarbonize. Now, there's two things going on here. One is the one Jürgen stressed, but the other is the one I wanted to close with. China's also in a period of extraordinary cultural turmoil. There's a term the Chinese use for themselves, which they would never use publicly. They call themselves bananas. Yellow on the outside, white on the inside. It's their way of saying, we really be honest, we basically become a Chinese version of a Western materialistic consumer society. That's been the path we've been on culturally, hence the banana metaphor. But the very fact that they can use the metaphor is occurring against a backdrop of some very much older ideas, which are not unique in any way to China, but to me they're exactly the ideas which are the anchor we're groping for now as we struggle with this crazy question, this vision question. How do we want to live? So I thought it'd be nice, given Jürgen's closing, to likewise close with a China reference, but a little different one. This is about 1,000 years ago, and you say, well, that's a long, long time ago. And how many Chinese know this? I would say most Chinese know of this. Just like they all can recite the great learning, they don't understand it because their minds have been so taken by this Western materialistic, technologically oriented progress. But there's another part of them, you might say, their hearts are longing for this. And by the way, you might be interested to know that, Chinese is interesting language. The oldest Chinese symbol, it's stick figure drawings, right? It's all iconic drawings. The oldest Chinese symbol for mind is actually a drawing of the heart. It's the Western cultures that confused mind or awareness with intellect. Most of the world's cultures didn't make that confusion. This is a good tool, but it's just a tool. Our understanding is often much deeper here and here. By the way, we now know there's 3 clusters of neurons in the human body. Now, this is the biggest. This and this are the 2 other big clusters. The intestinal tract has the 2nd biggest clusters of neurons in the human body, and the cardiac sac the 3rd. So around the world, when people want to talk about something meaningful, they'll make this sort of gesture. And it's not just a sentiment. It's really grounded. So I thought this would be an interesting way to close. Is this what's going on in China? Of course not. Who can say? China's hopelessly confusing. The process Jürgen talked about is going on. There's only one logical flaw with it. And you can be sure the Chinese are aware of this. If the Chinese do what you've been seeking a country to do, and do it in a very accelerated way, as they will probably do for the next 30 years, they know it's ultimately meaningless. They're part of a much bigger world. And if they decarbonize, and they go down this path all by themselves, and no one else follows, in fact, everyone keeps going in the opposite direction, we're all screwed anyhow. They'll have an impact, to be sure, because they're big, but not sufficient impact. This is a problem that confronts us all. This is a human problem. It's how we, the big we, want to live together. So my prediction is, pretty soon, that'll start to become evident to them. The Chinese have been very reticent to kind of bring their deep kind of cultural knowledge into the foreground because, first off, they're kind of conflicted about it because it seems very non-Western, non-scientific. It's the old ways. We had to get rid of the old ways to modernize. But at the same time, you see the modernization has created bananas. Who are we? Really? Are we Chinese, or are we just a bunch of people who buy Gucci bags? So this is the cultural turmoil, or tumult. It's a very creative time. So this little statement goes back 1,000 years. It's probably known by 90% of Chinese. Do they understand it? Who knows? That's the question for all of us. It's called the Western Inscription, written by someone named Chang Chi. This is, of course, in English. Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother. Heaven is my father, and earth is my mother. And even such a small creature as I finds an intimate place in their midst. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I consider my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my company. It's not that we don't know how to answer this question. We just never had to all answer it together. Thanks. So I think we're about official ending time, but I don't, if you want to do a quick question, we just break it. Then we go to our break. That's fine.
We're out of time for questions, but Peter's going to be around, so feel free to come up and talk to him during the break. I think it's wonderful. Thank you so much for attending. The break is over in Haskell Toreg, which